and we are delighted to welcome to Green Signals Richard Hines, the newly appointed Director of Rail Safety at ORR, and of course the 26th HM Chief Inspector of Railways in the Inspectorate's 183-year-old history. Richard, one question which journalists frequently ask, which I deplore, is an exception for me here. I don't like the how do you feel question. But given that your job was suggested and the job description in many ways written by George Stephenson, the father of railways, how does that feel, to that incredible weight of history standing behind you and in support of you and actually putting expectations on you? Do you sense that at all? Are you aware of it?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nigel. And first to say thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think the history of this role is really clear. You've described the kind of heritage of that. And of course, I take over for me and Prosser, who I'm really grateful to and have had the pleasure of working alongside for the last sort of 3.5 years. But I think my overwhelming sense is that of responsibility. This is a very serious role. It has a huge responsibility for the industry. And I think it's pivotal in that there is only one chief inspector, and very often the industry will look to that individual in this role to help shape, where the industry is going, to constructively challenge. And I think to be part of the industry and to help move us forward collectively.
Indeed, but let's begin, if we may. We said it's not about people, but let's make it about you just for a moment. I know you have a background in engineering and safety, but how did you get involved in HMRI in the first place? You were, of course, deputy for Ian for quite a long time. So I guess applying for the job, did that feel like a sort of logical move when Ian decided to retire?
Yeah, I think it did, Nigel. But to take us right back to my early career, I'm really proud to have started as an apprentice from school as a sort of trainee engineer, electrical engineer, and I'm really proud of that experience. I got a huge amount out of that, and I think in a similar way to what the railway industry does, I was really well supported by a good employer. I became a shift engineer. I worked among some very talented people, and I was, fortunate to be sponsored for a degree. Got chartered, and I came into regulation on the back of an intervention, actually from my future boss. I worked in a business that I thought had a good safety record. It was very supportive, but they had 2 fatalities in 3 years that really shook the business and the people that work in it. They were rightly prosecuted for those incidents, but I was impressed by the way that the regulator collaborated with the company, was able to really shape the future for them, help them improve, and met my future boss actually on the back of that intervention. So I've had 14 years at the Health and Safety Executive after that, where I was an electrical inspector, a principal inspector, and then became the head of operations, looking after a team. And more recently, I came across ORR 3.5 years ago, as you reflected, working for Ian, initially on secondment, looking after the Channel Tunnel, secured the Deputy Chief Inspector's job, looking after the non-mainline side of our work. And then, as you reflected, appointed to the Chief Inspector role round about Christmas last year, took up the role substantively in June when Ian retired.
Good pedigree then.
It's an amazing pedigree, that. Do you come into this role then with a sort of a personal vision around safety, and I suppose really what you would like to see done over your tenure, however long that is? Do you have a sort of a vision for safety on the railways?
So I'm 3 months into the role, Richard and Nigel. I'm still, if I'm honest, I'm finding my way. I'm still meeting colleagues. I'm still engaging with stakeholders. I'm still forming my views. But I think the vision that we already have here around zero industry-caused fatalities, ever decreasing other incidents, improvements in risk controls, increasing maturity, I think is as good as the day as it was written. It's difficult to argue against that vision. So my approach would be one of kind of evolution, not revolution. So what I'm looking to do is to build upon the really strong platform that Ian and the team have built over his last 16 years and way beyond that. I do, however, think there are some things that the industry can do to improve and should focus on, and I'll be, refreshing that vision, I suppose, is the right term, over the coming months. There's something about timeliness in my mind, about being a bit pacier with implementing change and recommendations, and maybe the adoption of technology, although that can be challenging. I also think there needs to be, a greater focus on health. So we talked a lot about safety in the past, but I think health is important. It's not as visible, it's not always as obvious, but it can lead to some really debilitating long-term diseases and experiences for individuals that are really unpleasant and unacceptable. And the other thing I would say is just really important to do the basics right every day. So get it right first time, every time. And that's what my focus will be on.
Okay, so in a generally good place, but you've highlighted a few priorities, I guess, there that you'll be focusing on. So which ones of those priorities that you've focused on there, would you say they're really key challenges at the moment? What's going to go next to number 1, when you jot a list down?
So I'll give a little flavour of what's happening across the different parts of the sector we regulate, if that's helpful. But clearly we've got a sort of reform agenda that's coming. You spoke, I think, previously on your show about the legislation that's working its way, through the parliamentary process. And of course, the shape, size, nature of reform and what that looks like is still being determined. But my role will be to make sure that we are active in that reform agenda. We're supportive of reform. It presents lots of opportunities, but also, I guess, potentially risks that sort of mistakes from the past could be repeated. And my focus will be on making sure they're not repeated. So that learning needs to be right at the forefront in the design of a new system. I think when you look across the different sectors that we regulate, I'll start with the non-mainline side, if I may. And that consists of the sort of 7 modern tramways, where I think we've reflected on some really good work from the Light Rail Safety and Standards Board, the LRSSB. They've kind of presided over a significant shift, I think, in terms of the way that sector works together, shares information, and there's some really good stuff being done there in terms of data. But it's also right to reflect that there needs to be an increased focus on making sure the recommendations from that terrible incident at Sandilands are embedded and built into businesses, particularly around sort of overspeed and driver vigilance. And that's a really good thing that I think the main line is learning from and can be introduced on the mainline railway. TfL continues to have a relatively difficult number of sort of platform train interface incidents that provide challenges. There's also more conventional slips and trips for passengers that of course cause issues, but they're moving into a phase and have done quite a lot of work in relation to modernising the system and the 4 lines modernisation programme, the subsurface lines, bringing them together. And the marriage of Victorian infrastructure and modern cutting-edge digital signalling systems presents huge challenges, and we've had some good work in that place to really make sure that that's being properly thought through. We, as you know, regulate the heritage sector. That I think is about 223 different railways across Great Britain. And I'm always amazed, actually, when I visit heritage railways, of the standard, the pride, the real capability that sector has, but also the fact that sometimes things go wrong. And you'll have read, I think, maybe last week about the Severn Valley Railway prosecution and the fall from height incident. And that's an example of where really basic safety controls, I would say, in the form of a fall arrest system for someone working at height wasn't put in place. But we do have a good relationship with the Heritage Rail Association, with Steve Oates and colleagues that are working really hard there. And that collaborative approach, I think, ensuring greater standardisation, greater consistency and greater sharing of information is something that will really help move the heritage sector on.
Can I agree? We'll maybe touch on heritage in a little while, if we may. But can I just go back to a point you just made there about overspeed and driver vigilance? Because that sounds like sort of quite a niche thing, but of course it's not. It's extremely important. And I suppose the question really is, some would say that health and safety on the railway, there's an element of balance, right? Because obviously the principle of as low as reasonably practicable, ALARP, is not the same as absolute. And do you think then that there is an issue of balance between good safety and safety by design, but also being able to deliver things in a value for money way? And how do you sort of manage that kind of conundrum, really?
Yeah, and I think this is a difficult challenge. And look, there's work to be done in both the safety space and the performance space, which is what I think you're referring to. But for me, performance and safety go hand in hand together. So very often a safe, healthy railway is the one that's performing at its absolute best and delivering for passengers and everybody that uses it. And that kind of analogy, I think, is something that I've seen in other sectors that I've worked and certainly regulated. That rings true. I think ORR as a sort of combined regulator adds real value in this space. And this is a difficult balance, Richard and Nigel, to strike. But the requirements of the law are really clear. That's the starting position. Companies have to do, and you've used the term, what is reasonably practicable. And that is a balance in terms of the degree of risk control that something offers versus the time, the cost, the effort in doing it. So it's not everything at all costs, and there needs to be that balance struck. And I think we've got, some good examples of where we've actively sort of engaged with industry, where we've, worked through situations where there have been proposals put forward that are above and beyond what's reasonably practicable, and we've tried to support and assist in that space.
I mean, I suppose I totally agree that a safe railway and a performing railway are axiomatic, really. They're absolutely the same thing. I wonder if I could just ask one question about, because you mentioned about overspeed. So one example I know recently, Avanti West Coast have been issued with, I think it's an improvement notice, isn't it, to install tilt authorization speed supervision on their new Evro trains, which are non-tilt. I suppose I was sort of scratching my head a bit with that and saying, well, why do you need to put a tilt authorization system on a non-tilt train? I think I understand why, but is that not a good example of probably, a little bit belt and braces and more being applied in practice?
So I think you'd understand when I say we're sort of involved in a legal process with this particular issue.
Yeah,
I mean, you're right to reflect that it's in the public domain. We have served an improvement notice. Avanti have appealed that notice and will now work through the process to resolve that, ultimately with a tribunal if we need to. I think the issue here is about the application of the train to that particular route and the TAS system that you referred to with the Super Voyager fleet that's being replaced. It's the speed supervision part of that we're interested in. And that is a automatic system that first warns the driver if the train is overspeeding by a set amount. And then if it continues, it actively applies the brake. And what health and safety law requires is for the hierarchy of controls, as we would say, to be adopted. So an automatic system is more reliable than one that requires human intervention, because we're all, possibly capable of making mistakes. And this issue is something that we're working with Avanti on. There's often the impression that there's a standoff when it comes to these situations, but actually we've got some really positive engagement with them and working through the plan going forward.
That's really encouraging to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, like Richard, my attention was caught by your point about a high-performing railway, because, high-performing, well-invested, well-managed railway, good safety is an output. It's not something you put in at the start. It comes out of those sort of things. I'm not sure that's always appreciated. And, of course, that is really crucial when you're in a process of change. And this comment that you made in your Chief Inspector's review from the recent report, Annual Report on Health, Safety, Britain's Railways 23 to 24, you said when talking about rail reform, quote, "Reform may require enormous change. Change presents many opportunities, but also significant threats to effective health and safety management. There are many instances where ineffective change management processes at every level across every part of our industry have been highlighted as a causal factor in major incidents. Poor change and project management also risk the inefficiency and performance of the rail system." They're salutary words indeed, and we are seemingly on the brink of very significant change once again. So how concerned are you about the hopefully imminent transition to Great British Railways, to GBR? And what role will HMRI play under your stewardship in ensuring that no one takes their eyes off the ball?
Yeah, and I think that's really important that you mentioned there, Nigel. So, reform does present lots of opportunities. I think it's fair to reflect that there is energy in the industry. People I speak to are actively looking forward to the opportunity to make things better for everyone that uses the system. But our role in a health and safety context will be to make sure that the new arrangements, do reflect best practice, do have features built into them that don't replicate the things that have perhaps gone wrong in the past. But, be really clear about it. My role, whatever the duration of the reform process, will be to make sure that there's a safe railway delivered every single day without fail. And it's going to be really important to make sure that people that deliver safety critical roles, that are in positions making decisions about safety, health, other matters, have their eyes firmly focused on what's happening today out on the network.
Richard, could I just ask about Network Rail specifically? They are the national infrastructure owner. They've, so many assets, many of them fairly old. It's a constant sort of battle to keep on top of that. What's your sort of reflection on them in terms of positives and, I suppose, challenges ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So, clearly Network Rail are a huge organisation, some 40,000 people, and I've really enjoyed my early meetings with Andrew Hines, Martin Frobisher, colleagues there. And I think there is actually a really strong relationship between us and Network Rail. We work collaboratively in many, many areas, which I think is, clearly positive in addition to the challenges that we sometimes have. But over CP6, Network Rail has delivered, some quite significant improvements, particularly in relation to track worker safety. I think there's been really good progress in relation to some of the health issues, such as hand-to-arm vibration and those types of issues, but also in terms of the asset and the infrastructure. So things like drainage asset inventories have been significantly improved over that time, and that's required a huge investment from the organisation. That being said, there's still more to do, and I think Network Rail would reflect that there is more to do. I'm particularly interested in things like structures examinations, which provide the primary risk control for, bits of the infrastructure that carry trains, carry passengers, but also to make sure that there is a really strong focus on health, particularly in areas like welding fume, where the fume has been reclassified as carcinogenic, and making sure that workers are protected from those types of issues. So I think good progress in summary, but clearly more to do.
Okay, no, that's encouraging. Thank you. I wonder if we could just move to talk about a couple of, if I call them newsworthy things. We're not interested in individual people or actors. We're actually interested in principles and process here. But they have quite big implications, I think. One of them, I don't think you'll be surprised, because it goes back to your point about heritage earlier in a way, are Mark I vehicles on the network and the regulations that were put in place in 99, I think, and in particular, obviously there's the structural stuff, but also there's central door locking and the requirements to have that. Now, you won, if I can use that word, a quite significant defence of a judicial review around one particular operator who was challenging the CDL stuff in particular, and you revoked the exemption as a result of that. Now, we understand that they then put in another exemption application, which they're obviously entitled to do. And we also understand, because the ORR kindly told us, I think back in June, that a decision had been made on that and communicated to the operator, and they'd been given a chance to sort of comment on that. But that was in June. I mean, this is quite a matter of, I suppose, public interest, really.
Oh, yes.
Where are we in that process? Because it feels 3 months seems an awful long time for chatting about a decision you've taken. When are we going to hear? When will it be made public what that decision is?
Yeah, so I think you've reflected, Richard, the history with this issue and the judicial review outcome, and the fact that we are actively working on a further application from the company. And as you say, that's entirely their prerogative. We're a fair, proportionate, I think actually quite open regulator, so we have to, preside over that, as we would for any other operator, actually, not just West Coast Railways. As you'd expect with this type of issue, it's particularly complex. But I think the expectations are really clear. I think our policy sets out very firmly where we are on that, and the judicial review outcome reinforces that. We are, in the process, we are engaging with the company. We've had meetings recently with them, and I would suggest we're approaching the sort of later stages of that assessment. But that's a matter between us and the company. It would be sort of unfair for me to give any more on that at this particular time. But rest assured, when that outcome is known, we will communicate that.
No, that's helpful. I wonder if I can just ask one supplementary on that, though, because this is what's happening today. So we know that there's a service running. It's the Jacobite service. And currently it has Mark 1s and Mark 2s, we believe, sort of interspersed within a rake of coaches. But they're Mark 1s that don't have an exemption, obviously, and they don't have CDL. So how, in that situation, they must be relying on something else, right, in order to be able to do that. How, in situations like that, does the HMRI get itself comfortable that that's okay, and that the conditions of the regulations that are being relied upon to run that rake of coaches in the way it is are also compliant.
Yeah, so I think the ongoing safety of that operation and actually any other on the railway is a priority for me and my team. But by using the Mark II stock that they are complying with the requirements of the law. The sort of carriages that fare-paying members of the public are using do have central door locking. If those members of the public were to be in Mark I coaches that didn't have that, they of course would be in breach of the regulations. But we have, very regular engagement with the company. We've taken sort of steps to gain assurance around the fact that they've got the controls in place. But ultimately, this is the company's risk to manage. Our job is to test, to challenge, to make sure that that's being done, and then to conclude, the application process that you've just referred to.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for explaining all that, Richard. Another live issue, if we may, Euston Station. It's been in the news very much recently, of course, but steering well clear of the claims and counterclaims made by any of the individuals involved. Can we talk instead about the process? Last September, ORR issued an improvement notice which had to be complied with by the end of December by Network Rail. Could you just walk us briefly through the process of how the duty holder complies with such an improvement notice, and how then you assess what they've done and their compliance, and once they have deemed to be in compliance, what that then says about how safe the asset is to remain in service?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Nigel. And look, I use Euston regularly and recognise that it's a busy London terminal. It has a huge number of passengers flowing through it. But I suppose the start of this sort of issue arose when we received a number of complaints regarding, surging and crowd control effectively at the station. And that led to an inspection that was conducted. And we found, gaps in the arrangements of Network Rail as the station manager at that facility that didn't meet the requirements of the law. The improvement notice, which is a time-bound piece of action that requires them to do certain things within a specified period of time, essentially said they needed to review their arrangements to make sure they reflected the actual circumstances at the station, and then to make sure that there was monitoring arrangements in place to ensure that they remain fit for purpose after they'd implemented them. We carried out a follow-up inspection at the station. We've had regular liaison with Network Rail, and the inspector formed the opinion that they'd met the requirements of the notice. They'd done what was required of them. Clearly, it's a dynamic environment at Euston. There is inevitably going to need to be a period of kind of fine-tuning, I would say. And of course, this is not just a Network Rail problem at the station, it's a whole system issue. We rely also on train operating companies who need to be part of the solution. And that, I think, is where Network Rail have focused their attention. But from our perspective, they have met the requirements of the notice, but we continue to have, dialogue with them as you'd expect.
Is it possible for you to shine a bit of a light on what you asked for and what changed? For example, do you now regard that there's fewer stampedes?
So the requirements of the notice were broadly for them to review their risk assessment, to review their arrangements, and to make changes in relation to it. And I'd say there's a clear difference between a busy station, which I think it's always going to be, but those situations where there is surging, for example, or as you've referred to, I think stampedes, Nigel, that clearly is a situation that could give rise to risk. And that, I think, is where the effort needed to be focused by Network Rail. But from my understanding, they've taken steps proactively to, one, deal with the notice, but also, two, in terms of its implementation, to make sure that they have, a better understanding and a greater degree of control in terms of what's happening on the platform on a daily basis.
Did you? Okay. You said you use it. Did you notice any changes personally?
So I used it off peak, I think, the last time I used it. So it was significantly quieter than it perhaps is in the morning or the evening. But the duty is on Network Rail to manage that asset and that infrastructure. It's a dynamic environment, but we're satisfied they've got arrangements in place that met the requirements of the notice. And now it's about making sure that they're properly implemented and there's a regular review of them to make sure they remain fit for purpose.
It is an incredibly difficult job to do, run that place, I can see.
Certainly is. Look, that's can we just maybe just go back big picture again now, just sort of, I suppose, really to sort of close things off. You said in the annual safety report that Nigel referred to a little while ago, you said this. I think these are incredible words. Great Britain's railways continue to be amongst the safest in the world. That statement is something we should all feel rightly proud of. It's an outcome that's the product of years of investment, strong leadership, a relentless focus on fixing important problems, increasing collaboration, and a collective commitment to ensure that lessons are learned and mistakes from the past are never repeated. I mean, I found myself going, when I sort of read that. But you said right at the beginning, we mustn't be complacent, and particularly when we're going through a period of great change. What would you say is the biggest thing, or maybe the biggest things that as an industry, as we go through this period of change, we need to focus on to ensure you're still comfortable writing those same words in future reviews?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And look, there is no one thing I don't think that I could point to, but
I didn't think there would be.
But I'll canter through a few of them, perhaps. So I think in terms of structures, reporting arrangements, independence is quite important when it comes to design of organisations. We've seen, I think the real value that organisations like the RSSB, Railway Safety and Standards Board, have added, and I think the industry has moved on significantly in terms of the use of data. So that is important to me. I also think, as I've mentioned, not taking half the day job, that was a term used by my predecessor quite extensively, but it's absolutely true. There are lots of opportunities to be distracted, but the railway runs today, it will run tomorrow, and way before these proposals are, worked up and implemented. It's a medium to long-term plan, I would suggest. But I think beyond that, there are some challenges facing the industry through, for example, climate change. We've seen that that's not a problem for the future. It's one that's happening now. Right to reflect that Network Rail have stepped up some very significant arrangements to respond to that challenge. And I think if we look at things like drainage asset inventories, the knowledge and awareness of, one, the existence of the asset, and two, the condition of it, has probably never been better than it is now through their work in CP6. But there's still further work to do in that area, and it doesn't concern me, but I think it's important to reflect that things like structures examinations, things like earthworks, making sure that we're on top of those issues is really quite important going forward.
Oh, that's excellent.
Absolutely. Just drawing to a close, Richard, speaking purely personally, if you like, as editor of Rail from 1995 to 2023, I had the sad job of reporting not only from the line side, as it were, after the serious mishaps including Southall, Hatfield, Ladbroke Grove, Potters Bar, Great Heck and Grey Rig, but also from the subsequent inquiries and investigations, which were every bit as challenging in every respect. And for me, the biggest and simplest takeaway on safety from all that experience is that the price of that safety is two words. It's eternal vigilance, isn't it? And one of the greatest privileges for me was dealing extensively over many years with the brilliant people at HMRI, which was always wonderfully led. And I've just been sitting here feeling very old because I realise you're now my fourth chief. I think the first was dear old Vic Coleman, going back quite a while. So thank you from Green Signals for joining us today, Richard, and for talking so candidly about a top priority of rail safety. And I know I speak on behalf of Richard and Stef in wishing you all the very best to go out where we came in as the 26th occupant. I think American presidents are the only other job where we say the numbers, don't we? So you're in good company there, maybe. 26 occupant as a post suggested by the father of railways himself, George Stephenson, who I'm sure is looking down on you right now, way back in 1840. So thanks ever so much for your time. We know you're at your hard press, so we do appreciate that. And I'm sure and I hope that we'll be talking again soon, formally and informally. So Richard Hines, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Thanks, Richard. And I'd love to come on a future programme and talk about how it's going in a few months' time. Great to see you both. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much.